Is in the Wharton building. You are in the Wharton building, and in the Blinken room in the Wharton building. Today's event is to hear from the authors. It's a wonderful story, very well told. I read the book, and I'm delighted that we're all here to hear more about it. I'm going to start and say a few words about the event, and then I'm going to call on the new president of the SUNY Press, Gary Dunham, here a couple months and full of vim and vigor, and he'll say a word, and then we'll turn the proceedings over to Vera and Don Blinken, Vera and the ambassador, escape and return. I have in my hand, and I'm happy to quote, a review from Foreign Affairs. There's only 500,000 subscribers, and the editor, who's James Hoagie of the, is that how you say it? Hoagie of Foreign Affairs, wrote this about the book, which SUNY Press is so proud to have published, and it's just getting around. Let me quote. It's a little small print, so just bear with me. Their memoir provides an illuminating picture of how embassies work to manage demanding and tense negotiations at pivotal points in history. It is also a gripping account of a refugee's escape and an engaging peek at the social and cultural aspects of ambassadorial life. I think that's a wonderful tribute to a book that has legs already, and I'm excited for the authors and for the press and for the Rockefeller Institute, because Ambassador Blinken has been a special friend of the Institute on many projects and in many ways, and is a good friend, both Don and Vera, of mine. And if you look in the book and look at the index, we spent a wonderful week at the embassy in Budapest, something I will never forget. So this is a very special moment for me, and I'm going to call now on Gary Dunham. Gary is the new editor of the head of the SUNY Press, and he is from this neck of the woods. Grew up in Glens Falls, and now he's back. And before he came here to be the new director of the SUNY Press, he was head of the University Press in Nebraska, which is one of the country's most distinguished and respected university presses. So we need him, and we've got him, and he's going to say a word. We are delighted to have the Whartons, Chairman Hayden, the Johnstones, Sanford Levine, people who are important to SUNY for this weekend gathering about SUNY's history, 6 decades of exciting things that we're going to hear more about during the weekend. So Gary, if I can call on you, I'm going to take a seat, and then we'll hear from the Blinkens. And I should mention that after today's proceedings and milling around, you can have them autograph a book, which I want to get, and I'm sure others of us do. Gary, thank you.
I think the most wonderful event for a person doing books is when we finally get to meet the people who've been behind the story. So it's great to see you again, Ambassador Vera. It's great to see you as well. There are times when we don't remember enough that there are real human beings out there behind the books. And events like this is what a publishing mandate is supposed to be all about. One of the real unique honors of being a publisher is to sponsor not only research, but also to help individuals share their stories with the world. And what a story we really have here. An essential mandate of the new SUNY Press is to sponsor books, sponsor works that bring New York State to the world and the world back home. And in this wonderful book, and in these 2 remarkable individuals, we have all of that. Vera Blinken was born in Hungary and was 5 years old when the Germans invaded. She and her mother narrowly escaped the Soviet occupation. In 1950, made their way to the U.S. She graduated from Vassar with a degree in art history and went on to practice interior design. returned to Hungary as the wife of the ambassador. She founded Primavera, the first mobile breast cancer screening unit in Central and Eastern Europe. In 2002, for services to the Hungarian people, she was awarded the Middle Cross of the Republic of Hungary. Donald Blinken is a native New Yorker and a die-hard Yankees fan. No. He was chair of the SUNY Board of Trustees from 1978 to 1990 and served as U.S. ambassador to Hungary from 1994 to 1998. He graduated magna cum laude in economics from Harvard University, and the ambassador is currently co-chair of Columbia University's European Institute, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and still making a real difference in the world. So, congratulations and thank you.
Now, first I have to turn it on. Do I have to turn it on? Yes, I have to turn it on.
First
I think it's on. Is it on? It's on. It's on. Thank you very much. I have the book with me because I just find that Donald and I are so proud of the book that I just like to have it with me. It's so beautiful. Where's Dick? Dick, thank you so much. There's wonderful hospitality. And I really feel as if we're a family here. I mean, my goodness, the Whartons, right? The Johnstones, SUNY, the Rockefeller Institute, SUNY Press. I mean, it's really Old Home Week. So excuse me if I get a little emotional about all of this because I feel very emotional. Now, we have been asked why Donald and I wrote this book. After all, others have escaped and others have been ambassadors. So why did we write the book? We wrote the book because we felt we had a very special story to tell. It was a very historic time when we were in Hungary. We arrived there in 1994, 3 years after the last Soviet soldier left. It was something to be recorded. And my story then was a complete circle because I left in 1950 as a child and went back as the wife of the American ambassador. Now, it might have never happened except for the State University of New York. And I will tell you about that later. There might not have been ambassadorship to Hungary or a book. But let me sort of go back a little further and start. I was born during the war, as was mentioned, and after we were liberated in 1945, we survived the war, my mother and my father. My mother wanted to leave. She said, it's going to be bad, we have to take the child out of here. My father was the cautious, careful type and said, no, it's going to be fine, it's going to be temporary. And actually he was right, it was temporary, but it was 45 years worth of temporary. So, my father died in 1948, and he was 44 years old. So my mother took that as a sign that she was right, and she had to get the child out of communist Hungary. It wasn't easy. If you remember 1948, there were supposed to be free elections, but no such thing. The former communists who went to Russia came back. They had anything but a free election, and the country became dominated by the Soviets. Mother tried many, many different ways. I was really too young to know and remember, but the opening of the book is Run, Vera, Run. We were running through the woods, and if you read the book, you'll see why. We were trying to escape. It didn't work. Mother tried many different ways, and none of it worked. And she was getting desperate, and she was resigned to the fact that really we will not be able to leave, when in 1949 they passed a law expelling foreign citizens. And my mother was the most adorable human being, and everyone always tried to help her. So the Italian ambassador, who was a friend of my parents, suggested to my mother that he will find a husband for her, and we will be expelled. And that's exactly what happened. mother married a very nice Italian man with an arrangement that it was marriage in name only for humanitarian reasons, and we were expelled. And the arrangement was that we were going to leave as a family to Italy. And when we got there, the marriage was going to be annulled. Well, that was all fine, but there was the child. And my mother did not want this Italian man to adopt me, because while the marriage can be annulled, an adoption cannot be annulled. So my mother said that my father didn't die at the age of 44 in order for his child to be someone else's daughter for the rest of her life. So what I remember is we were at the train station leaving, and my mother, her tearful farewells to the family, said, if they sent her back, take good care of her. And of course, I didn't know what that meant. It meant that they could have sent me back from the border. They could have looked at my passport and said, she's not Italian, she's Hungarian, and send me back and expel my mother. Well, it didn't happen. We're here. The train left Hungary with the happy little family and this ring that my mother said she's not going to leave without. This ring has an L. My mother's name was Lily, and it was given to her by my father when I was born. So we were in a sleeping car with a little pajama and a necklace and this ring around my neck. All right. Next thing Vera knew is we were in Vienna. And the train stopped. There were oranges and bananas, which the 10-year-old child had never seen. We made our way to Italy. The marriage was annulled, and we came to this wonderful country. And interestingly enough, coming here was the easy part. In 1950, there was a quota, and there were no Hungarians leaving because it was closed. There was the Iron Curtain. So getting out of Hungary was very difficult. Coming here was relatively easy. So there I was, wanting to be 200% American, never wanting to go back to Hungary. And in 1987, when our friend Ronald Lauder became ambassador to Austria, he invited his friends, and he said, but for you, Vera, there's a price to pay. You have to go back to Hungary. So Donald and I went back, and I cried for 4 days. It was so sad, and I felt guilty. And I think that's why I never went back before, because I just felt that I have such a wonderful life, and I'm so privileged, and I'm so grateful. And all those other people are stuck behind the Iron Curtain. So we went back, I cried, and said to Donald, now you see where I come from, and that's it. I never want to go back again. We were supposed to meet the American ambassador, but he was on home leave, so we never got to meet Mark Palmer. Again, fate intervened, and we met the ambassador at lunch that George Soros gave on Long Island for the Prime Minister the following year in '88, the summer of '88. And Mark Palmer said, I'm sorry, Mrs. Blinken, I wasn't there, but please come back. And I said, oh, Mr. Ambassador, no thank you. I've been there, Donald saw where I come from, and that's it. And this is where SUNY comes in. Bruce, where are you? There you are. The State University of New York was invited to Moscow in the fall of '88 to sign an agreement with Moscow State University. And instead of sending it by mail or faxing it, we all went. And we were supposed to stop on the way back in Poland. And again, fate intervened. Somehow there were no flights available to Poland. So Gail and Bruce said, well, why don't we go to Budapest? We haven't been to Budapest. We went to Budapest. And we had a very interesting time together. And if I may just digress for 1 second, remember Bruce and Gail when we had all our luggage and we wanted to take a taxi and we needed 2 And the cab driver, very Hungarian, said, if I can put all your luggage and all of you in one taxi, will you pay me for two? And we thought, goulash communism. So there we were, and Donald and Bruce went to university, their ambassador took you around, showed you around, and I went to a refugee camp where Romanian children were just being pushed even across the border by their parents if they were unaccompanied, just to get to Hungary, which they called freedom. And on the way after that to meet Donald and the Johnstones at the opera, the ambassador asked me if I'm going to get involved and do something in Hungary, and I did. I set up a foundation for nutrition and for cultural exchange. And from then on, I kept going back on a regular basis. And Donald kept coming with me, kept coming back with me. We were there in '89, in October of '89, just before the wall fell, for the first conference of the Peace Corps, which the foundation underwrote. And I think there were SUNY professors there as well for the conference for the Peace Corps. So, if that hadn't happened, I may have never gone back to Hungary, and there wouldn't have been an ambassadorship. So we kept going back, and when Bill Clinton won the presidency, and Donald was asked what he would like to do in the administration, Donald said he'd like to be ambassador to Hungary. And he was told, no, that's impossible. It's a career post. It's not a political appointment. And Donald said, but look, they got themselves out from away from the Warsaw Pact, away from the Iron Curtain. It's now about the economy. And I'm an investment banker. My wife is fluent in Hungarian, so we are the right couple. It took a while, but we went back. And it was the most fascinating 4 years I think Donald and I have spent. And it's hard to know where to begin because there was so much to do. I didn't know what to expect. I really thought an ambassador's wife, you get up in the morning, you get dressed, you go to lunch, and then you go to tea, and then maybe you go to dinner, and in between you do various other ribbon cuttings or whatever. Well, it wasn't like that at all. And in our ambassadorial seminar, they told us to be sure to prioritize, yes, and that was very helpful. Because otherwise I wouldn't have known what to do first. So I thought the first thing to do is try to make the home homey. When we arrived, and it's described in the book, so I won't really go into too much of it, but I found a staff who were not used to visitors, because visitors who went to the embassy had to be approved by the Ministry of the Interior, and they had to report. So there weren't too many people going there. They had grouch looks on their face, and they thought after a while that I was really very neurotic because I went around telling people to smile. And I realized that when people come to the residence, it might be their one and only time that they see America, and we want to put our best face forward. So I did that, and I think the most important thing we did is we found new help, because the housekeeper we found was a colonel in the KGB. That had to go. So after all that was done, and Donald was very kind, and he let me do things in the community because I spoke Hungarian. So I did the outreach to the Hungarian community. I did go to ribbon cuttings, and I opened the first boutique for water. I cut the ribbon for the first direct flight from Budapest from JFK, and it was very interesting. But I think perhaps the most useful thing I did was that I was Donald's interpreter. And although Donald had an official interpreter, they didn't quite get it. They got the words, but they really didn't get the meaning, behind what it was. And again, a good example of that is a university. We went to the University of Page, where Donald gave some remarks. And the question and answer period, someone asked a question of Mr. Ambassador. We had exchanges with the university, I forget which one it was. Arizona, thank you very much. And this year, they stopped it. Is it because we had new elections and your government doesn't approve of our government? And the interpreter interpreted the words, but really didn't get the gist of the question. And Donald, and I told Donald, you know, this is what they're asking. So Donald's answer was that perhaps they didn't have the funds for it. Maybe that's the reason, because it certainly isn't about not approving your government. But that was the mindset. And the interpreter could interpret the words, but really didn't understand the mindset. So Donald had his 24/7 interpreter in me. But if I have a legacy in Hungary, it's as Dick mentioned, it's Primavera. In the beginning, when we invited guests, I found that the women wouldn't show up. And we would invite couples, they would accept, but they didn't come. And I was very curious to see who these women were. So I organized a series of lunches and by different professions, and 20 women at each one. And we networked, and this was a whole new concept, networking. Because information and knowledge was very precious. You guarded it, you didn't share. Very communist thinking. So, before we left, a few months before we left, everyone said, Vera, we have to continue this, we want to continue. And I thought they're not going to do it unless they have me to organize it, the residents as a space to have it, unless they have a project. And the project we came up with, which it's the only one that 200 women could all agree on, was to raise awareness about breast cancer. It was a subject that was never mentioned, not thought about, not taught. And the only facilities were in Budapest. In the countryside, a woman had to go very far to have a mammogram, and only with a doctor's prescription. Unless there was something wrong and a doctor said you should have a mammogram, couldn't do it. No regular screening. So I thought, all right, well, if they can't come to Budapest, we'll go to them. So, therefore, Primavera, we raised all the money in Hungary. Again, this was a new concept. Raised the money all in Hungary from corporations, multinationals, and Primavera was started. We started with one mobile unit going around the country. There are now 43 permanent centers. And the best part about it is that it's supported by the Hungarian government. And there is free screening for women between ages of 45 and 65 biannually. There are 1.5 million Hungarian women, and they have the possibility to be screened. And I hope that that is my legacy. And I hope you enjoy reading the book as much as Donald and I enjoyed living it, and often writing it.
Before talking a bit about the book and about Hungary, I'd like to acknowledge a lot of the people who are here today, because the book would not have been possible without the contributions, direct or indirect, of so many of you. I'll start, obviously, with Vera. The book is really about Vera and her very exciting life and return to Hungary, and she obviously is the reason why we went back to Hungary, and that's the reason why the book was written in the first place. But beyond that, let me start with Cliff Wharton, who in his years as chancellor taught me a good deal about how to manage a complicated organization with many constituents and lots of problems. And I learned a great deal from Cliff, and it was invaluable in our embassy because, like the university, I had all sorts of people coming at me from different points of view, 400 people as a matter of fact, and the lessons I learned here at SUNY were extremely helpful. Bruce Johnstone, as Vera indicated, helped us very much by suggesting that we go back to Budapest in December 1988, because that visit to Budapest was really the one that got Vera and me totally involved in Hungarian matters. And Bruce subsequently was very generous in supporting what we were trying to do by recruiting SUNY faculty to join in some of the programs that we started in Budapest before the wall came down. And then, of course, turning back to SUNY itself and the SUNY Press, so many people have been helpful that it's hard to mention them all, but I'd like to start with James Peltz, who was the editor of our first manuscript, and I think gave us the encouragement and support we needed to go on with the book. Paul Grandal, who's here, was sitting over there, was very, very helpful to us in putting some of the material together. Later on, Laura Searle and her husband Duncan were absolutely indispensable in polishing the final result, giving us a book that people could actually enjoy reading and about which we would be extremely proud. And Gary Dunham was running the press, has also given his blessing to the book and to this whole project. And Vera and I are very, very happy with the appearance of the book and with the quality of the publication. And I think the book, as Dick said, is beginning to attract attention. We have a whole window in a bookstore in New York and Lexington Avenue, a number of interesting reviews coming up, some radio broadcasts, and I think the book will attract attention. I got a call last week from Warren Christopher, who's in California, saying he's read the book. I don't know how he learned about it, but there it is. He was very complimentary, but the important thing is he thinks that every young Foreign Service recruit who goes abroad should be required to read the book before leaving the United States, which I thought was very, very nice of him. So that's the story of the book, and if I left anyone out here who was helpful, I apologize, but I think you all know who did what, and Fran, of course, was very helpful to getting the book out to potential readers. The story of Hungary is a story of people's mindsets. When we got to Hungary, they would be very, very nervous about not only coming to the residence, but accepting advice from me or from my embassy. They had 45 years of communism. And the basic underlying train of thought was, if somebody tells you something, what do they really mean? They can't really mean what they're telling you. They have a hidden motive. And it took Vera and me about a year to persuade the Hungarians gradually that they could trust us. They could trust the United States. When Vera invited people to our home, there was no ulterior motive. When I suggested to the Hungarians that they might want to do this rather than that, it wasn't because we had some plot in mind, but it was because we felt it was in their best interest to do the following. For example, even as early as 1994, the Hungarians were thinking about European Union membership. And it seemed to me and my colleagues at the embassy that this was not realistic, that it was going to be very, very difficult for them to join the EU. The EU was a very rule-ridden organization with lots of conflicting interests within it, and it was going to take many years before Hungary qualified. But I said, look, NATO is another story. I think you could look at NATO realistically because this is something that you could do, and most importantly, the United States is the principal partner in NATO, and if we think you're qualified for NATO, I think your chances of being accepted are very, very good. And I think they took that message to heart. We'll talk about that in a moment later. The other big problem we faced was the Hungarian economy, which then, just as now, was going into serious decline. They had an enormous foreign debt, very high inflation. 90% of Hungarian industry was still owned by the government. It was a very, very unhappy situation. And the Prime Minister, Julia Horn, didn't really know what to do. He knew that they needed to implement some new austere measures, but how to go about it. I suggested that he read Margaret Thatcher's book where she describes how she closed down the redundant coal mines in Britain because they were no longer economically viable. And his answer was, well, Hungary is not Britain. So it was very difficult. But finally, late in 1994, early 1995, he began to see the writing on the wall. And I brought Dick Holbrooke over from from Washington to back up my message. We met with him several times. And finally, he the Prime Minister, fired the Finance Minister and the Economics Minister and the President of the Central Bank, and brought in two young Western-trained economists, George Sirani and Lajos Bokros. Sirani to run the Central Bank and Bokros to be the new Finance Minister. And they did what they had to do. They made some very tough decisions. Hungary's austerity program was implemented, and Horn did this knowing full well that if he implemented these measures, he would not be reelected at the next go-around, which was a few years later. And of course, he was right. The measures were implemented. The budget deficit was reduced largely through privatization. And Horn was not reelected. The socialists were thrown out. But he did the right thing for Hungary. And they're back in the same position today. They have a serious economic problem. Again, a socialist government. Rather late in the game, they've woken up to the fact that they have to take very austere measures to get out of the mess they've got themselves in. And oddly enough, two of the people who we mentioned as possible successors to the present Prime Minister of Hungary are Bokros and Sirani. So there's they recycle themselves in a way. Neither of them is going to take the job. They're too intelligent to want to be Prime Minister of Hungary for 8 or 10 months before the next election. But at least they were the first names that appeared to the Hungarian population as likely candidates to succeed George Hahn, the present Prime Minister. But in any event, we got the economy on track, and we did it by strongly recommending that they privatize Hungarian industry. But the privatization proceeds had to be dedicated to eliminating the foreign debt and reducing inflation. As I say, when we arrived, about 90% of the economy was in public hands. By the time we left at the end of 1997, some 70% of the Hungarian economy had been privatized. They did a good job. They voted lots of foreign companies. And wisely, they avoided the check model of simply saying, well, you call these public companies private companies by issuing pieces of paper to the Hungarian public. That would not have solved the problem. What they really needed was Western management and Western ideas. And that's what the Hungarians finally got to do. The other big issue, of course, was this NATO membership that I mentioned earlier. The Hungarians were early members of the Partnership for Peace, the organization created by President Clinton and some of his NATO colleagues to begin to give former Iron Curtain countries a sense of what NATO was about without actual NATO membership. But as you all remember, Bosnia reared its very, very ugly head. I felt and others felt that the United States would have to take a position in Bosnia. We couldn't let this matter drift because Bosnia was part of Europe, and if you wanted a Europe that was free and democratic with no strife, you could not overlook what was going on in the former Yugoslavia. Finally, the Dayton Accords came along. Dick Holbrooke was instrumental in that, partly because Vera and I had given Dick and his wife a wedding a few months early in our residence in Budapest. I think that encouraged him to do the right thing by way of Bosnia. But in any event, the Dayton Accords came along, and it became clear that NATO, obviously led by the Americans, would be instrumental in maintaining the peace in Bosnia, not even creating a peace, but in maintaining it, which meant that they would have to find a way of getting NATO forces from Germany into Bosnia and do it in a safe and reliable way. We had intimations that this might happen, but finally, in early November 1995, General Crouch, who was then heading U.S. forces in Germany, came to see me for a very high-level confidential meeting. He explained to me that NATO would have to find a base somewhere in Southern Europe to stage the Bosnian operations for peacekeeping. And they thought Hungary would be the likely place to stage these operations, but he wanted to know whether I might be willing to help them, help the NATO, help the United States in getting the Hungarian government to agree to a base in Hungary. Remember, the Russian troops had left 3 years earlier, and quite understandably, the Hungarian people were not enthusiastic about any foreign forces replacing the Russians in Hungary so soon after the Warsaw Pact had disappeared. But I felt myself that this was a critical moment, not only for NATO and Bosnia, but also for Hungary. So I said to General Crouch, you read about this in the book, General, I don't need a few weeks to think about this, just consider it done. So my embassy geared up. We worked with the Hungarian Foreign Ministry and Ministry of Defense, and finally got them in a very short order to agree that this would be possible at a place called Tasar in southern Hungary, a former Soviet base, air base, which had a railhead. It was near a city, the city of Kaposvár, and not too far from the borders to Bosnia. I got the Hungarian government to agree to do this, and in a 48-hour period, because there was a time deadline, the Hungarian parliament voted, I think, 390-something to 2 to permit NATO forces, American forces, to take over this base in Tasar to stage the Bosnian operation. I'm very proud of that because it made an enormous difference. Some 25,000 NATO forces were staged through Tasar in the first year and a half of our setting up the base. There has not been a single NATO casualty due to the peacekeeping operation since then, since 1995-96. And most importantly, Bosnia has more or less been a peaceful place. And so far as Hungary is concerned, it worked wonderfully because this was one of the keys to Hungary being viewed as acceptable for NATO. It showed that the Hungarians were willing to bite the bullet, do what they had to do, even though it might have been unpopular with the population, and accept responsibility for being part of Europe and not just looking after their own self-interest. We were very happy about that, and a year and a half later, there was a referendum in Hungary when Hungary was asked whether they would like to join NATO. The referendum was something that the Hungarians had gotten themselves into by accident. They had agreed that if they were ever to be invited into a foreign organization, there had to be a referendum. No other Central European country was foolish enough to require that criteria, but they had a referendum, and we were concerned about it late in 1997. I visited a number of cities in Hungary, made some speeches, tried to suggest to the Hungarians that this was critical for them because this would be the first time in 400 or 500 years when the Hungarian people actually had a voice in the outcome of their own future. They weren't going to be told what to do by the Turks, by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, by the Germans, and by the Russians. They themselves would decide whether they wanted to be part of a NATO organization or not. The referendum was held. The Hungarian people voted overwhelmingly for joining NATO, and most happily, the county in which the Tasar base was based, Kaposvár County, voted the highest percentage of people in favor of NATO membership of any county in Hungary, which proved that the American forces and the NATO forces had behaved well in setting up this base, had done what they had to do, and welcoming, unlike the Soviets, welcoming the Hungarian population to the base, showing them what we were about, and showing them that NATO was in their interest, not in someone else's interest. There were other issues as well that I think played into the willingness of the NATO and the United States to recommend Hungary's NATO accession. One was the relationships with Slovakia and Romania. After the Treaty of Trianon in 1919, Hungary lost 2/3 of its territory. 2 million ethnic Hungarians became Romanians, and about 500,000 became ethnic Hungarians became Slovakians. And those tensions existed, but they were forced under the rug all during the Soviet era. But when that was over, the people began to speak up. There were unhappiness on both sides of these borders. But I worked with my colleagues in Romania to try to get a treaty, and in Slovakia try to get a treaty between the Hungarians, Romanians, and the Slovakians, establishing a basis of living together peacefully, respecting one another's ethnic and cultural heritage, their language affinities. And finally, those treaties were signed in late 1996. Again, I think that those are strong signals to the United States and to NATO that the Hungarians were prepared to work peacefully, because one of the criteria for NATO, almost I think as important as the military criteria, is the acceptance of the fact that to be a NATO member one has to observe certain basic guidelines. Democracy, freedom of the press, human rights, and these are things that NATO stands for, and the Hungarians finally understood that. Which I think brings us to today. The Hungarians have, again, I think retrogressed to some degree. They've had a very poor economic performance in the last few years, partly due to the nature of the Hungarian psyche. The Hungarians are very mood variable. They're very down one day, very exuberant the next, and these moods tend to exacerbate their thinking. They may be very gloomy for 6 months and suddenly think that the world is wonderful and no matter what we do is going to come out well, and they overborrowed and overspent. Something I think we're familiar with here in the last decade as well. And as a result, they were in a very difficult situation. Hungarian people borrowed enormously from foreign banks in foreign currencies because interest rates were lower abroad than at home. And of course, when the currencies began to move against the Hungarian foreign, they could not repay these loans, and they have a serious debt problem. And that's why they've been forced to borrow recently, as you saw from the IMF. Hopefully they'll pull themselves out of it again, but a lot of it was very unnecessary, and I think a lot of it is due to their temperament, which I think runs two extremes. But as a matter of fact, I remember going with Vera to the Czech Republic, and somebody saying the difference between the Czechs and the Hungarians is that the Czechs have beer flowing through their veins, and the Hungarians wine. And I think that really describes the difference between the two countries. In any event, here we are. We wrote the book because we felt it's not a foreign policy book, but rather a book about what actually goes on, how we got where we were, what Hungary is like for an embassy, what other ambassadors are likely to face in other countries. I think it also suggests that ambassadors are not redundant, particularly in smaller countries. I heard from the ambassador to the UK that in 1996, Bill Clinton and Tony Blair spoke on the telephone directly some 55 times. I don't think Bill Clinton knew the name of the Hungarian Prime Minister. So you see the difference between being an ambassador to a modest-sized country and an ambassador to the UK or Germany or Japan or China or what have you. But I think ambassadors remain relevant, they remain important, and they're particularly lucky if they have wives who speak the language of the country they're going to. So with that, I want to thank you all for coming. It's been wonderful for your support and friendship.
Those are two wonderful talks, and with much that is moving and a lot that is important and insightful. We have a little time for questions. I have a question. And then the authors, I'd like them to come forward so they can answer the questions. I'll step to the side. Don and Vera have very kindly offered, thanks to Gary and all the people here from press, have been so wonderfully helpful to sign books so you can have a nice momentum of something special. I think the book works. I think it's very special. And Mary and I, my wife and I, had a wonderful visit in Hungary. Met a lot of the people that Don and Vera talked about, and we learned a lot, and we enjoyed ourselves with a lot of wonderful memories as we were sharing last night. And I think that the book says something, Don, that you covered very well as you closed off your remarks, that there's a sense in the world that since we've got computers and the internet, embassies are not really in the loop. But as you described it, and described it very well, the things that you did and the fact that you were there and knew the people because of Vera's wonderful support and knowledge of the country and the facility with the language, you were able to do things that come through very well in the book. You still got to read the book, but we got a wonderful picture of it from the authors. And so I would like you, maybe, Don, to expand a little bit, because this is what Mary and I thought was particularly fascinating about the book, in addition to Vera's wonderful story, so well told, that it's a glimpse into something. We got it personally by the visit we had, what it's like in an embassy, what it looks like, feels like. 400 people, that's a pretty big operation. So maybe you could expand a little bit on the presence, the fact that both of you were so involved in telling about this country and building understanding with many people, and certainly and importantly with the key people. So I think that's a very important role for this book. That's why I want you to, Vera, sell a lot of copies. And already I see signs that it's being picked up, and I can see why. So perhaps you'd like to expand on that, Don, and then we can take one or two more questions, and then Michael Cooper and Michelle Charbonneau will arrange for people who would like to get an autograph, and for those of you who can, we're going to have some lunch, so you can join us for lunch. And so, Don, to you.
Well, there are lots of other things going on, but before I forget, and I want to thank you, Dick, very much for your wonderful hospitality. His visit to Hungary was very important. I wanted Dick to talk to local government officials and central government officials in Hungary, because if you think you've got problems here between local, state, and federal agencies, and the situation in Hungary was disastrous, but Dick gave some very interesting talks, and I think calmed down the populace a bit while he was there. I also recommend that all of you, when you get the book, read page 148. You'll discover who first suggested that Hillary Clinton be Secretary of State. You'll also learn why the Pope and I got involved with Madonna in Budapest. These are some of the things we did. We also had, but as Dick said, seriously, some issues to try to remind the Hungarian people about, issues that I felt reflected well on the United States and which they had forgotten in 45 or 50 years. One was ethics in business. It's a talk that I don't think I could give today, but for 2 or 3 years I gave a talk at the Economics University on why it's important if you're to young Hungarians who are going to business school. If they wanted to become players in international business, they had to be ethical, and they had to look for companies that had ethical standards. And that, otherwise, they could make a lot of money, perhaps in a year or two, but in the long run, it was not going to work out either well for either them or for Hungary. And these talks, I think, were well received. But as I say, after Enron, I would have been embarrassed to give that talk, and I'm very glad I was there when I was. Another issue that I felt was important, which is discussed in the book, was restitution, particularly to Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. There were about 20,000 living survivors, Jewish survivors in Hungary when I was there, and they hadn't received a dime from the Hungarian government in restitution. The government taking the view that it wasn't really their problem. After all, the Russians had run Hungary for the last 45 years, but we persuaded them that this was not correct, that there was a serious restitution problem due to the surviving Jewish community. And I'm very happy to say that by 1997, they passed a law whereby the survivors, those still living, they're mostly very elderly people, got $50 or $60 a month, which for Hungary is a lot of money, paid to keep the lights on in their apartment and the heat on. And it was the first such restitution program for the Holocaust survivors in Central and Eastern Europe. Vera and I also felt that the United States had so much to offer culturally that Hungary should be reminded of this. Vera organized the first fundraiser for a Hungarian cultural organization, the Fine Arts Museum. They had never heard of the idea. She organized a big cocktail party and a reception for the opening of an art show. I had borrowed from the National Gallery in Washington a Titian portrait to match one that the Hungarians owned. And this was an occasion to say, look, this is how you go about getting the public involved in the arts. And we brought, we also were very happy that American orchestras came to Hungary. When the Cleveland Orchestra came to give a couple of wonderful concerts, Vera and I bought about 25, 30 tickets. We handed them out to the ambassadors of the other major countries to Budapest to make sure that they understood that apart from business and military power, there was great cultural quality in the United States. The Cleveland Orchestra, you couldn't pick a better example than that. So we had them to the concert and to a reception afterwards. And this is the kind of thing we tried to do together to suggest to the Hungarians that there's more to life than just making a dollar or surviving. You have to also begin to think about the things that made Hungary very special: music, the arts, and regain some of your own cultural heritage through the private sector, not just rely on the Hungarian government.
Very nice. Vera, would you like to comment, or should we open up to Dolores?
Vera was recently recognized by the government of Hungary. Could you tell us about that, please, the honor that they gave you?
Oh, that's very kind of you, Dolores. Thank you. I was recognized, I was given the Middle Cross of the Republic of Hungary for my work with Primavera. And I'm very proud of it. And may I tell the story of the president of Hungary?
You're not censored here. We're just, it's a free society.
I was especially proud because when we were leaving Hungary, Donald received the highest civilian honor from the government of Hungary, and the president of Hungary, who is everybody's favorite uncle, whispered to me in Hungarian, said, "I wish I had another one of these to give you." And I was, very happy. And he said, "Why don't you tell your husband to let you wear it some of the time?" So now I have my own. Thank you. Thank you.
Another, Tom?
Yes, it's a question for Vera. I was wondering, I know you mentioned that in your early meetings, social meetings, that the women never showed up.
That's right.
And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the role of women in Hungary, their economic opportunities or educational opportunities, whether that's been changing since in the last decade or so, since the end of communism.
Well, I was very surprised when they didn't show up. And as I mentioned, that's why I wanted to meet them. And when I met them, I was equally surprised because they were all fabulous. And they were all professional women with careers, and they never even knew that they had been invited. Because coming to the residence of the United States ambassador before the change was always business only. There were no social occasions. So these women just were not used to accompanying spouses or anyone else, and there were very few women in the government or in the business circles. But they all were working, and they were doing serious things. So much so that when I had these lunches, I was so happy to see them, that they were in very high positions, also in government. There are many women in parliament. I don't know the percentage, but many. And the professions were open to them, many doctors, many lawyers, a lot of women in education. They don't get paid the same amount as men do, and they still don't. But they are there. And they came, and as I mentioned, they were very surprised to see each other because they didn't know each other. They might have been in the same profession, and they didn't know each other because they were hoarding all this knowledge for themselves. It's changed. And one of my pleasures really was to open up the embassy. When we arrived, there was a protocol officer who had been there for the past 20 years. And she had a list of those who were approved to go to the residence of the American ambassador. And as I mentioned, because they were approved by the Ministry of the Interior, and then they reported. So much so that we gave a reception once when somebody said, "I'm happy to be here because the last time I was here and I refused to report, they said they'll take my passport away." It was that serious. But we changed that.
Bruce?
I will say a few words tomorrow about one of the differences between American public universities and most other public universities in other countries, which is the difference between a governing board, which is allied to a public interest, but is not part of the government. It's very precious to Americans, this sort of depoliticization of systems. My segue now is that I think most American academics, I want to address this to Don, would say, gosh, that really ambassadorships should be career people. My guess is there's a bias toward that. And one of your books, one of the great things about your book is, I think, is you start explaining the power of the political as opposed to the career ambassadorship. I think you say a few more words about that.
Well, first let me say that the quality of our career Foreign Service officers, at least in my opinion, is extremely high. They're dedicated, they work hard, they're bright, they write well. They all are extremely impressive, and they tend to be young people. This obviously applies to the people who make it up to the top, which is to be a career ambassador. Traditionally, and I'm going back down to the end of World War II, about 30% of U.S. ambassadors are political, politically appointed. It runs about 30, 32, 33%. I think it's a good idea, and I think even though the Foreign Service people are naturally happy about it because it means that number less jobs for them, I think it's good for the United States for several reasons. First of all, I think people coming from the outside, not coming from the State Department, often bring points of view, experiences, approaches to problems that are not traditional to the State Department and to the government. Some of these ideas are good, some of them are not so good, but they're fresh ideas. And I think a little fresh air injected into the system is generally a good idea. I learned, for example, from my business experience that it's not a bad idea to have a quarterly review where everybody in the top management sit down for 2 days with written pieces of paper describing what they've done for the last quarter, what they felt the problems were for the next quarter ahead, what they should do about it. This was never as far as I was able to determine, a State Department methodology. So I instituted that kind of approach in the embassy in order to give everybody in the embassy, not just 2 or 3 people, a sense of what we were about, what our goals were, and how we were going to achieve them. But beyond that, I think it's important that foreign governments occasionally feel, even if it's not true, that the ambassador has a direct telephone line to the President of the United States. Now, you don't deny that if somebody asks you the question, but it isn't necessarily true. But if they think that way, it's useful because sometimes you can get things done much more quickly that way than if you're a career officer and have to play all of the angles that a career diplomat has to play in order to make an impression on the foreign ministry of the country to which you're accredited. And finally, just to finish, I think there are certain decisions that a political ambassador will make that a career ambassador is loath to make, having to do with not only with political matters, but things like real estate. The career ambassador is always concerned about his or her next post, and they don't want to do anything that will look as if they're difficult or troublemaking or controversial, because 2 or 3 years from now they're going to be assigned someplace else or go back to Washington, work in the department. The political appointees know that this is it. You're not going to have another post. Whatever you do, it's the end of the story, and you say what you think and try to get some common sense implemented in the operations of the embassy. So I think, on balance, Bruce, I would say having non-career people in embassies is a good idea.